Let me go ahead and resume here. So my introduction for everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name's Idella with the Center for Technology Commercialization, or CTC, and I'm here with Marie Finley, President of Biotech Policy Group and FDA Regulatory Strategist and Health Policy Consulting. It's a health policy consulting firm. And we're going to talk a little bit about her experiences in working with clients to try and navigate the FDA process. So hello, Marie. Thank you for joining us today. How about this? Can you set the stage and tell us about yourself, your firm, and some big picture learnings in working with startups as they negotiate the FDA process?
I am the founder and president of Biotech Policy Group, a FDA regulatory consulting firm based here in Milwaukee. My previous positions included serving as vice president of Celgene, GE Healthcare, and Amersham Health, and also at Hershey Foods Corporation. I have a lot of government experience. I was the chief investigator for the HHS and FDA programs at the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Government Reform. I was an FDA regulatory consultant to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Biomedical Research and Development Authority, BARDA, which, as you know, is doing a lot of work in the COVID-19 space. And I was also a member of the HHS Advisory Committee on Blood Safety and Availability, which reviews safety and availability of blood products for the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I was at the FDA in the Office of the Commissioner for 4 years as a special assistant. I'm a certified regulatory affairs specialist and the author of numerous reports and articles on FDA regulations and orphan drug issues. I was named to the list of top 50 global thought leaders in orphan drugs and rare diseases by the World Orphan Drug Congress. And I just accepted an opportunity to serve as a regulatory expert and entrepreneur in residence at Concordia University. I do some work for the Medical College of Wisconsin's Technology Evaluation Committee and Ascension, Wisconsin's Institutional Review Board.
That's quite a robust experience.
Thank you.
So we have, hopefully we'll have a great discussion here today. And, when we initially had a conversation, you discussed how important it was that companies can and should be in charge of their FDA process. I think maybe it might help for us to set the stage by discussing some of the key terms that we talked about in our initial discussion that might inform a company's process and strategy. Maybe let's start with kind of the end product, which I thought was really good in our discussion. And you mentioned the label. So can we talk a little bit about how we work backwards from what you kind of want to thinking about where you start? And maybe let's just, at this section, just define a couple of key terms for people.
Sure. That's a great approach. I really do think that working with startups, they have commercial plans, they have product development plans, they have clinical plans. Nobody ever has a regulatory plan, at least not one that's ever been written out. And I really think startups are doing themselves a disservice by not thinking about that seriously and really planning for it at the earliest possible stage. So that's the biggest message I have to convey today. And I would say the label, which is what goes on the product, it's in the patient package inserts, it's all of that, to really define what this product is, how it's going to be used. That's what the label essentially does. If there are risks associated with it, those have to be disclosed in that labeling as well. So really having an idea about what your technology can do and how you want it to enter the market with that label is very important. So I don't really know that particularly scientists think about the regulatory part of it. They think about, I have this great technology and it can do all these great things, but they really don't think about what it, at the end, you're really narrowing that process, right? As you move through clinical trials, et cetera, for the most part, you've got multiple shots on goal or multiple trials. And when you get to a point where you really say, this is the indication I want to pursue, this is the disease, this is what the drug can do, then you're in a position to start looking at what kind of supportive programs FDA may have for the review of that product, where you fit in terms of an unmet medical need, those kinds of things. But it all starts with having a really clear idea of what you want the end result, the label, to look like.
We didn't talk about this, and maybe it's better to place it in kind of process and strategy, but I can't help but ask, when you're thinking about the label, and as companies are trying to work backwards from there, is there any way to say, let's take up kind of a common product label and break it up into the sections and build a strategy off of that, or go to a competitor's product label and think about how you work backwards from how you want to best or be better or add new value or consider safety issues? How might you take the physical product of the label and start to kind of deconstruct that towards strategy?
I mean, obviously, the very last thing that you're going to do when your product is going through the review process is negotiate with FDA on the actual labeling. What I think people need to have isn't a rigid view of what that word, where the goes in the label. What they really need to have an understanding of is, how is that product used? Is it a clinician type product? Is it a home product? Is it an OTC drug? If it's a prescription drug, is it something that's for an unmet medical need, and how do you define it? So at each point there's a definition. So we want to define how the product, what the product is. If we know a mechanism of action on it, we should disclose it. FDA does approve drugs without mechanism of action, but they're going to ask for one, so it would be good to have an idea of what that is, and to try and incorporate finding a mechanism of action, if you're not sure of it, in your clinical trial. You need to know what the endpoints are. If you want to negotiate with FDA on a surrogate endpoint, because perhaps you don't have a really clear understanding of a disease process, that's really important. You have to be able to justify that in your negotiation. So, defining those kinds of things. How do we define efficacy? How much do we know about safety? And pull that all together in some kind of outline, because when you go into FDA, you have to have some materials that will support your position. And to the extent that you know the natural history of the disease, that's really important. In rare diseases, we don't have that information, probably 8 times out of 10. But to the extent that you can pull something together, that's very helpful. How will the product be dosed? Oftentimes when you're starting a clinical trial, or you're getting to the point where you're considering it, you could develop an oral dose, you could develop an IV dose. At some point you have to make these decisions, and you have to have solid reasons for doing so. They can be commercial reasons, and they can also be patient reasons or safety reasons or whatever. Is that helpful?
That's really helpful, because there's a lot of buckets of information that you can start with to really understand how to build and think about that end product and the strategy to get there. Which I think it's good then for us to go to the next section here, and we talked a lot in our initial discussion, and you're really speaking frankly here, that you, as the company, as the owner, you got to be in the driver's seat to negotiate your path with the FDA. And really knowing some of these end goals that you just mentioned can really help that company work backwards towards a plan. So can we talk a little bit about what strategies, how much information, how can a company go about understanding customers so that they can work backwards towards that strategic plan? One of the things that came up was, how much in-depth market research? How do you think about market research if you're coming from the angle of that end product of a product label? What information is important to have, and how can we build a strategy around that?
I think the first thing to really understand is, what's the need? Obviously, there are commercial aspects of that, but there's also regulatory aspects of that. Is there something currently in the market that is very difficult for patients to take? It's difficult for clinicians to administer. Why are we developing this product for this particular need? Really having a clear idea should give you some of those answers. And then really understanding how we can prove that that product is both safe and effective for that indication, that disease indication, is really important. So those are the sort of big first questions you have to ask, but you have to ask them with a regulatory focus.
Let me kind of switch a little bit back here because depending upon what your focus is, there may be some avenues and options from the FDA for resources and help and things like that. Can you maybe give us a few examples of asking those right early customer problem questions and then kind of thinking about what that FDA process might look like or some of the opportunities that are available through the FDA to help you navigate this road?
That's a really good question. The first thing I would say is if this is a rare disease, it's, it has a patient population, it's defined in US statute as less than 200,000 in the US, it's an orphan drug. Start with the Office of Orphan Drugs at FDA. Their job is to be of assistance and also to advocate for rare disease applications within the FDA system. I would meet with them before I met with the Disease Review Division at FDA. Secondly, there are other, and actually a variety of programs that are available to companies, which I think would be useful. There's a Fast Track, which is a process designed to facilitate the development and expedite the review of drugs to treat serious conditions and fill an unmet medical need. So the key word for Fast Track is unmet medical need. There's Breakthrough Therapy, which is a process designed to expedite the development and review of drugs that demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapy. So there's already something in the market, but we have something that's better. There's also Accelerated Approval, which allows drugs to be reviewed for serious conditions that fill an unmet medical need based on surrogate endpoints. And an example of this would have been the Sarepta Exondys 51 application. And then for priority review is FDA's goal to take action on an application within 6 months. So with each of these programs, there are various levels of support that the agency will give and certain, privileges. Sometimes they provide a lot of technical expertise in the development of the clinical trial. That's really key. Because if you get that input, then you're sort of building everything around that input, and therefore, technically, you should be able to not miss any steps or have any issues going through. So most of the time that works. Occasionally, there are some times when it doesn't, but that's usually when we don't have a lot of information about the natural course of the disease. Secondly, you get with some of these the ability to submit applications in sections so that you can be working on the last section, but you've already submitted, your first phase 1 or phase 2. I'm not a big fan of that because generally if you find unexpectedly some problem in the latter stages of the clinical trial, you're pivoting and that's not a good thing. And, you're going to have to change your plan, which means you change the terms that you've negotiated with FDA. And that's not my favorite way of approaching this. But there are a lot of available support mechanisms for companies, large and small, and they should really consider those when they're when they're initially approaching the agency.
How do you recommend that companies begin to have that first chat with the FDA? Are there some documents that they might need to prepare ahead of time, that they should prepare ahead of time to have a good first step with the agency? Of course, we're assuming that you've done all your homework, right? That you have a really good argument. But I know in some cases, right, you can have like a nice one pager, a nice executive summary, a detail of what you're trying to achieve. Or what's a good way to organize that first conversation?
I think that there are a lot of resources on FDA's website. I would go there first. I would look at things like requirements for an IND that you need to conduct a study in humans. I think you really need to think about, where are we in this process? Are we ready to sit down with FDA and talk about a human study? I think you really need to look at your patient population. whether there might be some unmet medical needs. Are you eligible for anything that, medical countermeasures, or if the patient population is primarily female or primarily minority, is there something there that would give you the opportunity to get support from the Women's Health Office, the Office of Minority Health, et cetera? So some diseases, particularly the genetic diseases, you have patient populations that are much more discrete. So, that's an important thing to be aware of. So I would start there and then get a consultant. For the most part, a lot of companies don't have that expertise in-house. They have clinical expertise, or they have device expertise or something like that, but they just don't have the regulatory expertise. Someone to sit down and say, all right, this is how I'd approach it. And these are the documents. I would not go into FDA without written documents of some kind. And I'm pretty adamant about that with clients. So we spend a lot of time on those documents, but there's a reason for it, because it makes the meeting go much more smoothly. Everyone understands what the goals are, and sometimes you need that within your team to really understand what the ask is going to be. And it's really important for companies to approach a regulatory agency and say, this is our best thinking on this disease. You may have more expertise as a company or as a clinician with this disease indication that FDA actually does. I mean, they may have world experts on staff, but they may not. So you're the best expert of your own technology. So you really need to be able to make that shine in the meeting.
That's an excellent point. There are a couple of questions here in the chat, so I'll take a moment here to go through them. First question, so do startups usually finish the regulatory process, or do they wind up being acquired or partner with another group who will deal with the majority of the regulation? And I guess the follow-up that I'll add to that is, when is it a company's responsibility, even if somebody else might be taking portions of the regulatory process later down the road?
It is always the company's responsibility to handle the regulatory. And there's always a lot of regulatory decisions that have to be made. Even if you're only working in animals or just working in animals, there's a lot of regulation of that as well. So there's no point that you can be studying something and you're not subject to some kind of regulation. So at what point does the really, shall we say, heavy lifting kind of regulation come? I guess it depends. If a larger company acquires you or acquires the product, generally they will do the clinical trial type work if they acquire it before then. I've worked for companies where they acquired assets after they had been approved by a much smaller company. And the smaller company had to do everything up through approval and negotiate the labeling. So I'm not sure it's equivalent to an exit strategy, let's put it that way. And I certainly wouldn't be afraid to manage your regulatory process. And being afraid of that shouldn't prompt you then to exit the company sooner than you might otherwise do so.
I'm just going to ask a couple more questions on that. Do you have any anecdotes, any stories, I guess, on that point, right? So of course you shouldn't be afraid. So some steps that maybe some startups can do to empower themselves so that they aren't afraid. Of course, going to the website, there's a lot of information, that kind of stuff. Hire consultants if you can. We'll get into that in a second. But then also, if I like the point that it's not equivalent to an exit strategy. So there's some steps that a company should and could take, to kind of help position themselves and have a better conversation, even if they are going to get acquired, say, before the whole labeling process.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly understanding that if you are going to be in negotiations with a company, they will be looking at your regulatory stuff. So you can't just say, I'm just waiting to be acquired, and then here it is, and you can deal with it from here. It's also important to make the right decisions, because a disincentive for a company to acquire an asset or a smaller company would be if they botch the regulatory process. Nobody wants to come in and be somebody else's cleanup mechanism. So, it is important to do it. I would certainly say if you don't have that expertise in-house, you really do need to have expertise, find a way to hire it, and work with that person. A lot of regulatory people, they're not necessarily full-time for smaller companies, just like other professionals who may work for a company. They can be part-time employees or whatever, or part-time consultants. But that shouldn't, you should never step away from the regulatory responsibility thinking that somebody bigger is going to come along and straighten it all out for you, because you may have made choices or negotiations with FDA about clinical trial design or something that a company may not want, So I always assume that it's my responsibility all the way through. I would assume that until, somebody else comes along and says, I'll take over, So if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. So the next question is, how long does it normally take? What timeline should a company expect to get for final approval for a pharmaceutical or even a medical device?
Well, that varies a lot. Officially, the numbers from the larger pharmaceutical trade associations are that it takes upwards of 750 million. Sometimes somebody claims 1.2 billion, and 12 years to develop a product from initial discovery to administration, with an approved indication. That is true, I think, of larger research organizations and larger pharmaceutical companies, because they're factoring in the costs of, all the things that didn't develop, and the 200 other versions of that drug that they had to abandon to get the exact one they wanted. So I think it's a fair number, but it's also not the reality of a startup that has an asset or a discovery and is trying to develop it. So in terms of time, I would say it's almost impossible to tell, but with startups, they don't have the 12 years. So I think they're moving a lot faster. And I think that a lot of the resources available in SBIRs and STTRs really encourage you to be able to move from, a phase 1 study into humans relatively quickly within a phase 1, 2, 3 application. So devices, same thing. I mean, you might have engineering issues that you're trying to resolve early in the process. It also depends too, if this is a drug that's already been approved, maybe you're developing a generic drug, an existing generic drug for another indication, probably not going to spend that much time. If you get access to the original drug master file within FDA, that can shave off a lot of time, provided, of course, the information that the previous company, who might have written it up in the 50s, if they did a good job, that's great. If they didn't do such a good job, well, you might not have saved that much time. So there are a lot of ins and outs to this. And it's really, I guess one of the other points I would make that I would really emphasize is that each case is unique, and you really have to sit down and look at the strengths and weaknesses of each situation. And every startup has them. So it's a matter of really working with what you got. And
so if there's other questions in the chat, please put your questions in the chat. There's one more that I do want to read, because we've talked a little bit, and I just feel like it's a good point. And that is, companies, the pitfalls that maybe you've seen for people who haven't had a regulatory plan early. And I guess in the ways that startups might scramble when they, didn't need to necessarily scramble. I don't know if you have one story maybe that sticks out about that bad approach.
I will give you a composite story because it's pretty common. Generally, the discoverer of a technology is the greatest advocate of it. That can be good and it can be bad. They think, obviously, they're holding the cure for cancer. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But they want to get in and treat critically ill neonates as quickly as they possibly can, and they don't really understand that this is a longer process with a lot of, stop gaps and hurdles that you have to overcome. And they're very impatient and difficult, frankly, to work with. you have to work within the regulatory system that's been established by the United States Congress and administered by the executive branch. I don't care who you are, but they often struggle, and I kind of have to say, don't shoot the messenger. I'm telling you what the path is here, and it may take you a number of years. If you don't have safety information on this product, you are not going to an IND in critically ill patients. I don't care how much, and this is something worth sharing as well. In this COVID-19 environment, it is not possible for companies, or let's say it's not probable for companies to immediately go into patients just because there's a national emergency or a need for new products does not mean FDA is reducing its burden of proof in the safety and efficacy area. I think a lot of companies are struggling with that. So that is the composite of a lot of startups, because no, they didn't have that exposure, and that's what their let's just say their reality is somewhat incomplete.
I think that's excellent. I'll ask this question as a parlay into the next into our last area, and that is, having now that you kind of understand that there's a strategy involved in working with the FDA and making sure that your technology is safe and efficacious as a really important end goal. Finding the right person or persons to kind of help you navigate this is really important. So the question is it better to talk directly with the FDA as a company, or use a consultant as kind of an intermediate person to kind of have that dialogue? And if it is a good fit to work with a consultant, what are some strategies a company should take to make sure they have the right fit?
All right. The first question is it easier to approach the agency with a consultant? It can be. You're not required to use a consultant, but oftentimes companies don't take the time to read the website. They don't know that they've got an orphan indication. They don't understand, what will be required and how they need to be prepared for these meetings. So even big companies often do shoddy work in that area and in meeting prep. So I think that's important. The second thing is you really have to understand what you're being told by a regulatory agency. I had a client a while back. I was doing some due diligence for someone else. I was not representing the company, and they had a long history of FDA interactions. And it was obvious they weren't listening. They had to have been given really good advice, and they just didn't follow it. And finally, we got authorization from them to talk to their regulatory consultant. And, when we talked with that individual, that person told us exactly what I had told the client. They were given instructions and they didn't follow it. That's a really bad position to be in. So whatever it takes to not be in that position is important, whether you think you'd feel more comfortable talking to a consultant. Oftentimes consultants will speak, for an hour or two, and you just tell them roughly what you've got, and they'll give you an off-the-cuff opinion. Some people want more detailed information and take more time to review something. So those are all things to consider. In terms of getting a right fit, I think you really, they're all kinds of clients, there are all kinds of consultants. You need to have someone who, or what I prefer is someone who will work, shoulder to shoulder with me on the development of something. And that means having a respectful relationship. If a client is raising a legitimate reason why they might want to take a different path than what would commonly be, accepted, there may be something unusual about their technology or their patient population. I think you have to give them a fair hearing. But if, someone says, look, I don't think that this is doable. I don't think this is ethical. I don't think this is, something that will be accepted by the agency. I think you as a client need to hear that message.
Excellent point. So we are coming up on time here. So I'll ask if there's maybe one final tip that you might share, especially if a startup is thinking about working with a consultant and they're trying to find the best cost-effective way to manage those relationships or enter into those relationships, what might be a good step that they could take, a good question that they could ask to begin the process well?
I think to the extent that you can frame the situation from a regulatory perspective for a consultant is important. Make sure that you've got a summary of your technology, a summary of what your safety and efficacy would be, what you think your timeline might be, if you've got interested clinicians, if you have a patient population that's well recognized. Oftentimes they're not, particularly in rare diseases. And what we're looking for is making sure that they fall within that orphan drug, patient population that's defined in statute. So to that extent, really pulling together the summary documents, I think are important.
That's great and practical advice. So I want to say thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for giving us some helpful perspective on navigating the FDA, especially from a startup. I'll end by saying the Center for Technology Commercialization is Wisconsin's free resource for SBIR support, and we manage a number of grants and programs helping small businesses and entrepreneurs consider, compete, and win SBIR funding. There are several upcoming deadlines for health tech innovation, so it's never too early to reach out. And for Anne-Marie, I assume we can go ahead and pass along your contact information. You yourself are very busy, I understand, but if there are some companies that are out there that would find you as a helpful consultant, this will be a good way for them to reach out and get connected.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thanks, Adela.
No problem. Thank you.